There are things happening in America, such as anti war rallies and civil rights demonstrations, that no one has ever seen before. There are very few countries in which such things could happen, but they can happen here. And that's what our system and that's what gives our system its strength. In most countries, all change goes in the other direction, and eventually you end up with an armed revolution. The beautiful thing here is that it's happening in an orderly way. He smiled, then continued. One reason for the protest, of course, it's not the only reason, but I think it's a contributing factor, is that our kids are taught in school about justice and equality. Then they find out the world isn't run by justice and equality, and they want to do something about it. Today, on Good Friday, 1969, we remember the life and sacrifice of Martin Luther King Jr., who gave himself totally to the nonviolent struggle for peace and justice. In his letter from a Birmingham jail, Dr. King describes better than I could our hopes for the strike and boycott. Injustice must be exposed, with all the tension its exposure creates, to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion before it can be cured. For our part, I admit that we have seized upon every tactic and strategy consistent with the morality of our cause to expose that injustice and thus to heighten the sensitivity of the American conscience so that farm workers will have, without bloodshed, their own union and the dignity of bargaining with their agribusiness employers. My experience has been that the poor know violence more intimately than most people because it has been part of their lives, whether the violence of the gun or the violence of want and need. I think that once people understand the strength of nonviolence, the force it generates, the love it creates, the response that it brings from the total community, they will not be willing to abandon it easily. How can we narrow the gap between the wealthy and the poor in this country? What concrete steps can be taken now to abolish poverty in America? There are a number of things that President Nixon could do immediately if he wanted to. In terms of our own grape pickers strike, he could tell the Pentagon to stop shipping extraordinary amounts of grapes to Vietnam, the government's most obvious tool in its attempt to break our strike. And he could improve the lot of all farm workers in the Southwest easily under existing legislation by putting an end to the importing and exploitation of cheap foreign labor. The Immigration Service has allowed almost 500,000 poor Mexicans to flood across the border since 1965. Absorbing this number of resident aliens would not be detrimental if they actually became residents. But most of these workers return to Mexico after each harvest season, since their American wages go much farther there than they would in this country. They have no stake in either economic or political advances here. It is the domestic farm worker who wants our union, who wants better schools, who wants to participate in the political system. Our poor Mexican brothers who are allowed to come across the border for the harvest are tools in the government's and the growers' attempts to break our strike. Nothing is going to happen until we, the poor, can generate our own political and economic power. Such a statement sounds radical to many middle-class Americans, but it should not. Though many of the poor have come to see the affluent middle class as its enemy, that class actually stands between the poor and the real powers in this society. The administrative octopus with its head in Washington, the conglomerates, the military complex. It's like a camel train. The herder way up front leads one camel and all the other camels follow. We happen to be the last camel, trudging along through the leavings of the whole train. We see only the camel in front of us and make him the target of our anger, but that solves nothing. The lower class reaches of the middle class, in turn, are convinced that blacks, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Indians, and poor whites want to steal their jobs, a conviction that the power class cheerfully perpetuates. The truth of the matter is that even with automation, there can still be enough good paying jobs for everyone in this country. If all of us were working for decent wages, there would be a greater demand for goods and services, thus creating even more jobs and increasing the gross national product. Full and fair employment would also mean that taxes traceable to welfare and all the other hidden costs of poverty presently borne most heavily by middle income whites would inevitably go down. We will build power through boycotts, strikes, new unions, whatever techniques we can develop. These attacks on the status quo will come not because we hate, but because we know America can construct a humane society for all of its citizens, and that if it does not, there will be chaos. But it must be understood that once we have substantial economic power and the political power that follows in its wake, our work will not be done. We will then move on to effect even more fundamental changes in the society. The quality of compassion seems to have vanished from the American spirit. The power class and the middle class haven't done anything that one can truly be proud of, aside from building machines and rockets. It's amazing how people can get so excited about a rocket to the moon and not give a damn about smog, oil leaks, the devastation of the environment with pesticides, hunger, disease. When the poor share some of the power that the affluent now monopolize, we will give a damn. For example, Catholic charities, agencies, and the Catholic Church has millions of dollars earmarked for the poor, but often that money is spent for food baskets for the needy instead of for effective action to eradicate the causes of poverty. The men and women who administer this money sincerely want to help their brothers. It should be our duty to help to help direct the attention to the basic needs of the Mexican Americans in our society, needs which cannot be satisfied with baskets of food, but rather with effective organizing at the grassroots level. The approach that Malcolm X used was the House meeting. He was doing those things that we know pay. Being patient and just accumulating, committing people, and so forth. He's gone, but his spirit continues. On May 2nd, 1971, in the midst of anti-Vietnam War protests, Chavez spoke with sympathy towards a group called Vietnam Veterans Against the War, while relegating their strife to the greater, while relating their strife to the greater struggle against violence in American society. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this meeting. It's hard for me because we in the farm workers movement have been so absorbed in our own struggle that we have not participated actively in the battle against the war. What causes our children to take up guns to fight their brothers in lands far away? In our case, thousands and thousands of poor brown and black farm workers go off to war to kill other poor farm workers in Southeast Asia. Why does it happen? Perhaps they are afraid, or perhaps they have come to believe that in order to be fully men, to gain respect from other men, and to have their way in the world, they must take up the gun and use brute force against other men. But we are responsible in another more basic way. We have not shown our children how to sacrifice for justice. Say all that you will about the Army, but in time of crisis, the Army and Navy demand hard work, discipline, and sacrifice. And so too often our sons go off to war grasping for their manhood at the end of a gun and trained to work and to sacrifice for war. For the poor, it's a terrible irony that they should rise out of their misery to do battle against other poor people when the same sacrifices could be turned against the causes of their poverty. But what have we done to demonstrate another way? Talk is cheap, and our young people know it best of all. It is the way we organize and use our lives every day that tells what we believe in. Farm workers are the last are at last struggling out of their poverty and powerlessness. They are saying no to an agricultural system that has condemned them to a life of economic slavery. At the same time, they are making a new way of life for themselves and their children. They are turning their sacrifices and their suffering into a powerful campaign for dignity and for justice. Their nonviolent struggle is not soft or easy. It requires hard work and discipline more than anything else. It means giving up on economic security. It requires patience and determination. Farm workers are working to build a nonviolent army trained and ready to, if we provide alternatives for our young out of the way we use the energies and resources of our own lives, perhaps fewer and fewer of them will seek their manhood in affluence and war. Perhaps we can bring the day when children will learn from their earliest days that being fully man and fully woman means to give one's life to the liberation of the brothers who suffers. It is up to each one of us. It won't happen unless we decide to use our own lives to show the way. One of the great miscarriages of justice is that the people who provide food for the world don't have enough food for themselves. It's horrible. I can't understand it. Take the Philippines, for instance. There are no unions there. They import people to work just like we do here. And they move them from island to island, from province to province. In West Germany, they bring in farm workers from Spain and Portugal. In Mexico, they can't get Mexicans to work in the hemp, so they import workers from Guatemala and treat them like braceros. They're exploited just as the Mexicans are in this country. The damn exploitation of farm workers is consistent. King proclaimed, "There comes a time when people get tired of being tramped over by the iron feet of oppression." My friends, the time for action is upon us. The enemies of justice want you to think of Dr. King as only a civil rights leader, but he had a much broader agent. He was a tireless crusader for the rights of the poor, for an end to the war in Vietnam long before it was popular to take that stand, and for the rights of workers everywhere. Many people find it convenient to forget that Martin was murdered while supporting a desperate strike on that tragic day in Memphis, Tennessee. He died while fighting for the rights of sanitation workers. Dr. King's dedication to the rights of the workers who are so often exploited by the forces of greed has profoundly touched my life and guided my struggle. During my first fast in 1968, Dr. King reminded me that our struggle was his struggle, too. He sent me a telegram which said our separate struggles are really one, a struggle for freedom, for dignity, and for humanity. I was profoundly moved that someone facing such a tremendous struggle himself would take the time to worry about a struggle taking place on the other side of the continent. Just as Dr. King was a disciple of Gandhi and Christ, we must now be Dr. King's disciples. Dr. King challenged us to work for a greater humanity. I only hope that we are worthy of his challenge. The United Farm Workers are dedicated to carrying on the dream of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Just as Bull Connor turned the dogs loose on nonviolent protesters in Alabama, the growers turn armed foremen on innocent farm workers in California. The stench of injustice in California should offend every American. Some people, especially those who just don't care or just don't understand, like to think that the government can take care of these problems. The government should, but won't. The growers use their wealth to buy good friends like Governor George Dukumajan and Ronald Reagan and George Bush. My friends, if we're going to end the suffering, we must use the same people power that vanquished injustice in Montgomery, Selma, and Birmingham. I have seen many boycotts succeed. Dr. King showed us the way with the bus boycott. And with our first boycott, we were able to get DDT, Aldrin, and Dieldrin banned in our first contracts with grape growers. Now, even more urgently, we're trying to get deadly pesticides banned. The growers and their allies have tried to stop us for years with intimidation, with character assassination, with public relations campaigns, with outright lies, and with murder. But those same tactics did not stop Dr. King, and they will not stop us. Once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. You cannot uneducate the person who has learned to read. You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride. You cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore. In our life and death struggle for justice, we have turned to the court of last resort, the American people, and the people are ruling in our defense.